Thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. We've all seen pictures of Washington State like this that clearly indicate it's a left-leaning state. However, when we look closer, is that the true story? All right, we're back to Washington State, and I've done a couple of videos recently where we talk about the election results, late mail-in ballots trending more Republican, for example, and some of the other results that came out of the 2020 elections. This time, I think it's worth digging a little bit deeper into these results and analyzing them to determine just exactly how conservative or how left-leaning Washington State actually is. And it's easy to look at this recently because of this election. Essentially, what an election result is, where all these ballots came in, all these people filled out pieces of paper and sent them in and ran them through the machines and produce essentially what is a very comprehensive and thorough poll. It's a snapshot in time, but it's a poll that has a lot of participants in Washington State, about 4.8 million, and that represents roughly 84% of the voting population. And because it's broken down by counties and by smaller jurisdictions, you're able to really look at a much more granular level how people feel about different issues or politicians or other things. And it does give you a snapshot, an idea of exactly how the people in Washington feel about these issues and whether they're more on the freedom-oriented side of things or whether they're more on the left-leaning collectivist side of things. This really does help us understand when we look at them. Now, Washington State has a reputation. It has a reputation of being very left-leaning. Governor Inslee kind of personifies that as kind of the green governor. And depending on how you look at him, he's the Grinch that stole Christmas, or he's the part of the green movement or gang green, and issuing in the new utopia. And that's certainly the platform that he ran on when he ran for president with his recent failed effort in 2020 as the presidential candidate. But he did succeed in running for governor, and because of that, you can see the distribution across the state that you normally would find when you look at just the counties. There's 39 counties in Washington State, and the blue counties here voted for Governor Inslee, and the red counties here voted for the challenger, Loren Culp, who was running against him. Again, millions of votes went for both candidates, 1.7 million, for example, for Culp, and a little over 2 million for Governor Inslee. Now, regardless of accuracy or problems that people have about the election results, and I share some of those concerns, and that's a separate topic for another day, let's just look at this as a snapshot and a survey of how Washington residents view the issues and the politicians that are in front of them. There were two incumbents that were Republicans, statewide incumbents, who were on the ballot as well at the same time. There was State Treasurer Duane Davidson and State Secretary of State Kim Wyman. They were both Republicans, they're both statewide office holders, and we can use the election results in their races as well and see exactly how some of these jurisdictions voted for them. So for example, in the Duane Davidson race, and Duane Davidson lost, he got 46% of the vote, a little over 46%, but he was able to, in addition to the counties that the Republican challenger Loren Culp picked up in the governor's race, Duane Davidson picked up counties like Skagit and Whitman and Clark County, for example. So he picked up a few more counties that shifted red in his direction. It's even more dramatic when you look at Kim Wyman, who also added Snohomish County and Kitsap County and Thurston County and Pierce County to that list. So when you really looked at the election results for Republican Kim Wyman, who did win with over 2 million votes, there were only 4 counties that didn't go her way. Small counties like San Juan and Jefferson County, with relatively small populations that are very left-leaning and serve as bedroom communities for wealthy people from Seattle or from the King County area. And you also had King County, which is the main population center in Washington State, and you had Whatcom County up north, where Bellingham is located. So this is a different result than what you'd see. This would make the state look a lot more conservative than if you just simply look at the results from the governor's race. However, people oftentimes are critical, and I share this criticism at times, because just because you vote for Democrat or Republican candidate in a specific situation doesn't necessarily reflect how you view all the issues. And this is true in Washington state as it is elsewhere. And you can't always use this kind of partisan affiliation to determine, are you a conservative voter or are you not? It's kind of one way of looking at it, but it's not necessarily applicable. There's personalities, there's baggage that both parties bring to any kind of an election, and those national baggage issues or fights that are going on a national level don't necessarily translate consistently at a local level of how people feel about things. So let's look at the policies and see how people voted on the policies, of which we had several options in Washington state. There were, in Washington state, when the legislature passes tax increases, because of an initiative that was passed a number of years ago, a Tim Wyman initiative, it allows people to actually vote, and it's a non-binding vote, but it nevertheless allows the voters to say, do we want to repeal the tax that was just passed by the legislature, or do we want to maintain that tax? And this is an example of one of those initiatives, one of those advisory votes that just happened. And the vote here, the green area is the part of the state that said, hey, we want to repeal this tax that was just passed. And the yellow area shows the counties who decided that they wanted to support the tax that was just passed. So as you see, very similar to how the county breakdown was for Republican versus Democrats, you do see this distribution of, in this case, 60% of the voters in Washington state, over 60% of them, opposed the tax increase. And every tax increase that was passed by the legislature and signed by Governor Inslee in this last session that was on the ballot, every one of them was voted by the voters to be repealed as an advisory vote. Now, we don't expect Inslee to listen to that or the legislature to pay attention, but nevertheless, the voters are expressing their viewpoint in what amounts to a really advanced survey that shows that most of them don't support the tax increases that are being pushed by the insiders. This is fairly consistent, too, if you look at last year, in 2019, the $30 car tabs campaign, which also had a majority of Washington state who said they wanted a return to $30 car tabs instead of the ever-increasing car tab expenditures that you see that the state imposing on vehicle owners right now. And again, you had the same three counties, San Juan, Jefferson, and King. Whatcom and Island joined them this time, and then Thurston County. And Thurston County joined them mainly because that's the area where all the bureaucracy is located, the state government, state capital. And so many people probably view their employment as dependent on increasing taxes there, although it's interesting, those same people oftentimes vote to repeal them. So this is a way of looking at some policies, and this one was kind of interesting with the $30 car tabs, because this still passed despite a massive multi-million-dollar corporate-funded and insider push to not pass $30 car tabs. And despite that, most of the voters passed it. You had all kinds of situations where not only did the supporters violate the campaign finance laws by trying to disguise and conceal the fact that they were funded by major corporations in all their mailers. They concealed that information from the voters. You also had places like the city of Olympia who decided to egregiously violate the law and send out illegal mailers at taxpayers' expense. I filed that complaint, and they were fined about $10,000 just recently for it, or at least the county manager, or city manager was fined for that. But this does give you a little bit of a snapshot of how people view policies and how it breaks down across the state. But this kind of misses some of the picture. There's a bigger picture here that you can actually get and understand if you want to drill down and get a better sense of how different communities feel about these issues and whether they're more conservative-leaning or more left-leaning. You have 39 counties, but each county is broken into a number of voting precincts. And some of these some of these counties actually have a lot of precincts. King County, which is the largest, has over 2,600 precincts. Where I live in Thurston County is about 300 precincts. And some of the smaller counties, like Wahkiakum, has 11, and a number of the smaller counties in eastern Washington, they'll have smaller numbers of precincts as well. But this allows you to actually look at the election results in a much more granular level and see exactly how some of these communities and neighborhoods voted. And so for that type of analysis, I went to my friends over at Voter Science and had them break down the election results in a more visual way for us to see. And when you do this, it's kind of interesting. The red here basically represents precincts that vote apparently for pretty much all Republicans when they come on the ballot. And the blue areas will, at least in this last election, voted for the Democrats. In this case, I was using the Secretary of State results and the governor's results as the two comparisons. And so the blue means that they voted for Inslee and they voted for Gail Tarleton. The red means they voted for Culp and for Kim Wyman. The most interesting areas are the yellow areas because those are areas that split their vote. Those are areas where they did not vote for Culp, but they did vote for Wyman. And those areas also overlap with areas that also voted to frequently reject the tax increases and also to support $30 car tabs, for example. So from a political science standpoint, those areas are going to be pretty interesting. Now, the question that my friends who are from Eastern Washington in particular are going to have is, wait a second, how did these big blue precincts come in the middle of a sea of red in Eastern Washington? How can this be? How can we actually have these big blue precincts over here, more left-leaning precincts? How do we get those votes? And this is kind of interesting. That's why I like this detailed analysis. Washington State actually is, I believe, the state with the largest number of reservations, with some of the native tribes that have been here even before statehood. The federal government had signed treaties and set up these reservations for 29 different tribes. And not all of them are treaty tribes. Some of them had reservations set up separately, but basically there's 29 of these in the state of Washington. And even though there's not a big population on these reservations, the way the precincts are broken down, there is a common voting that you'll oftentimes see in some of these locations. And so, for example, when you go back to this map, you can see in the upper part, northwest or northeast quadrant, the Colville and the Spokane reservation, they tended to vote more Democrat. The Yakima reservation as well, the Makah up on the peninsula, and the Quinault and Ho just further down on the Olympic Peninsula there. And that's probably no surprise because the native tribes in Washington State give millions and millions of dollars. 95% of their money actually goes to the Democrat Party. And so it would kind of be a surprise if they didn't support the leaders of these tribes and how they distributed their tribal cash. And most of that's going to the Democrat Party. But not always. If you look at where the Cowlitz or the Chehalis or the Nisqually tribes located, they tend to vote more in line with the rural residents who are also living in those areas. But it is kind of interesting. That's why you see these big patches of blue in a couple of these more sparsely populated areas of Washington State. More interestingly, when you dig deeper into the deep population where you have millions of people living along Puget Sound, this is where the battleground areas really are for the heart and soul and future of Washington in a lot of ways, just because there's so many people that live here. And you can see that it's not a uniform sea of blue the way it's oftentimes presented by those who live on the east side of the state. And it's really a bunch of patchwork areas where some areas are a little more conservative, some areas are clearly battleground areas. But when you have these urban core centers, you can see that there's a large population that lives in a couple of these urban cores, and they do drive and affect the results in those counties. So Seattle has a big impact on King County. Tacoma has a big impact on Pierce County. And obviously Olympia has a big impact on Thurston County, for example. They don't necessarily, other than King County, which I think the population of Seattle is so large and such a high percentage of King County that it has really a disproportionate impact there. But these urban core areas really have a big impact, despite the fact that the rest of the precincts in those areas are either battleground precincts or pretty conservative. And so it's really worth looking at this a little bit more detailed because from a political perspective, you're going to have your political fights for both sides are going to be going on in these yellow areas where people have the ability or interest in switching either direction. They could vote either way. And when you go to Eastern Washington, for example, and look at Spokane, and this little patch down here is actually where Cheney is located, and this is where Eastern Washington University is located down here. So you have the presumably that's going to be where most of the people who work there and the students who go there, that's how they vote. And this little patch right here that's kind of odd, this is actually the airport. It's an odd precinct that looks like it's a sparsely populated precinct, but it's kind of odd. But this area, this center blue area for the city of Spokane, that is actually legislative district number 3. It's the third legislative district that sends Democrats. It's the only district in Eastern Washington that actually sends Democrats to the Washington State Legislature. So even though you see a sea of red in Eastern Washington, there's still pockets of more left-leaning voting patterns, and the city of Spokane is one of those examples. Another example is the city of Olympia, which in this urban core, you can kind of see it's once you get outside that urban core, you're either in a battleground district surrounding the city, and it's a sea of more conservative voters all the way to the Pacific Ocean and pretty much all the way down to the border of Oregon. South Thurston County votes no different than Eastern Washington, most of Eastern Washington, for example. Now, when you look more closely, you can see that Evergreen State College represents a big patch of this blue as well outside of that urban core. This is why in Thurston County, even though they voted for the Democrat candidate in both 2016 and 2020, in 2016, despite that, the Democrats lost every seat on the Thurston County Commission because of this yellow area around Olympia where the voters there are willing to actually split their vote and vote for somebody that's not in the Democrat Party and not left-leaning and put more moderate or independent people in office rather than go with the extreme urban core vote from the downtown Olympia area. And that's also why they would vote for Kim Wyman for office, for example, and you would see different voting patterns in Thurston County than what this urban core where the junkie camps and the homeless camps are located than what that necessarily would indicate. Again, if you go all the way down to southwest Washington, right across the river from Portlandia, where Portland is dealing with still just this expansion of a history of months and months and months of riots and homeless camps and new autonomous zones and all kinds of problems, right across the border is a little pocket of more left-leaning voters in the city of Vancouver. And even though Clark County oftentimes goes Republican, and the other legislative districts that are located in the area just outside of downtown Vancouver, they do send Republican representatives and state senators to the legislature. This urban core, this downtown urban core of Vancouver in the 49th Leg District, they do send Democrats up there, even though and then there's a sea of red all the way up to Olympia from here. So you can see really this concentration of voting patterns as you look around the state. Same with the North Puget Sound area. When you look up here in Whatcom County, you'll see the city of Bellingham, which is substantially influenced by Western Washington University, which is located there as well. And you'll also notice this little island, Whidbey Island, which is where the 10th Legislative District, the north side of that island, tends to be much more conservative in voting. The closer you get to Seattle down below, it gets a lot more left-leaning. And if you look below where I had the Whidbey Island title block there, you'll see these little patches of blue down in Clallam County that indicate where Port Angeles and Sequim is located. And next to them, and where Jefferson County comes up, you see the other patch of blue peninsulas. That's where Port Townsend is located. And again, that left-leaning kind of pocket. But this granular level of detail shows where these concentrations of urban voters are located. And it seems like that's a lot more realistic and more granular and more interesting than just looking at an overall analysis of the state here where you just see how these counties voted, maybe for the governor's race there, or like this one with Wyman and Tarleton, where you're seeing which counties go which direction, but it doesn't really show you where those voters are located. And so I think that this map gives a lot more interesting, especially you get a full resolution map here where you can really look at the precinct level results and maybe try different ways of looking at some of these results at a much more detailed level. And Voter Science is a great place to go and to get this information, and I think they do a great job in explaining when you look at things visually. If you're a visual learner, this is just a little bit more helpful in understanding where these battleground areas are in the state. But no surprise, there is an urban vision for Washington State. And that urban vision, the vision for utopia that Inslee promises that we're only 2 to 3 tax increases away from attaining, is very visible. When you look across Capitol Lake from the governor's mansion, you can see the homeless junkie camps that are located there, or how they're dealing with drug addiction in these urban areas, encouraging it and supporting it so that it flourishes, and how they support kind of a lawless environment, like this photo from Seattle shows from early this summer, where riots and arson and broken windows and lots of damage is becoming a lot more the norm than the exception. This is a vision for Washington State, and one part of Washington State represents that. And oftentimes, the conservative movement tends to focus on, the Grinch that stole Christmas, or Inslee's high tax increases, which are certainly legitimate issues of concern and a big deal that many people are suffering through and suffering from. But it ultimately comes down to these two visions for Washington State. When you look at how conservative or left-leaning Washington State is, there is this urban core that's very left-leaning, where riots are accepted, where high crime, traffic congestion, high taxes seems to be the dominant result of the local political leadership and the special interests that keep them in office. Outside of those areas, it's much more conservative. The rural small town suburbs of Washington State don't vote much differently than what you would see areas of Texas or Idaho or rural Oregon. This is going to be a very common perspective in how they view the way government should interact with them in their lives versus this very dedicated kind of focused urban core. And ultimately, for a conservative message to resonate in Washington State, for a liberty, freedom-oriented message, you have to change some of this urban voting pattern. You have to convince them that there are conservative solutions to having junkie camps everywhere where you fill your parks with needles and tents. There are conservative answers to high taxes where you don't necessarily need high taxes, and that government is not the utopian solution for every problem. Where traffic congestion can be addressed in a more efficient way than the ineffective squandering of resources currently being used, and where high crime shouldn't be tolerated and encouraged the way it's currently being encouraged in these areas. And ultimately, for more liberty and freedom-oriented message, a conservative message to resonate in these areas, looking at these precincts and understanding the ones that can switch already, that are already interested in being open to those messages, I think that's an important thing to look at. And also in these deep blue urban areas where they're having a lot of these problems, a conservative message needs to be able to resonate and needs to be communicated to them. Thank you for watching. If you like what you see here, please share this video and this channel with your friends and other people who you think might also be interested. We've been growing very quickly lately, and a lot of that comes about because people like you are sharing this information. If you want to learn more about what I presented in this video, you can go to wethegovern.com and you can see some of the links that I provide below. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and like and share with others. And remember, when it comes to political change, the future does belong to those who show up.